Hi, I'm Brad, everybody. I just want to take the time to thank Pennsylvania State University, the Atheist Agnostic Association, and YASIC for the opportunity for this debate. So today I will be debating the historical evidence behind Jesus' resurrection. So anyway, I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to be doing, okay? I'm not going to be saying the Bible says so. So I want to make that very clear. I'm not saying you have to believe it because it says it in this book. However, I will be using the Bible as historical documentation, and I will be using books of the Bible that even the liberal scholars will agree with. So everything I'm using here is going to be agreed upon by all spectrums of scholarship, whether it be conservative, Christian, liberal, or atheist. I'm presenting what's called the minimal facts. Almost all the facts I'll be giving is what 90% to 99% of liberal scholars will agree with, because that's what they minimally agree with. So I just want to make that very clear. So this is just going to be from a very strictly historical perspective here. And I'm just going to be presenting data. Now, the reason why I'm defending the resurrection of Christ is found in Romans 10:9. So it tells us there that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So the bottom line is, if Jesus is not God and he did not raise from the dead, Christianity is false. So for anyone who wants to disprove Christianity, disprove the resurrection. It's that simple. You know, that's all you got to do. However, though, I don't think you can. So I'll be presenting just some evidence behind why I think Jesus rose from the dead from a historical perspective. Another note on historical data, too. I don't know if a lot of you know this, but a lot of historical data that we have from ancient times was actually written 300, 400 years after the fact. Plutarch and Arrian are two well-known scholars who did a bibliography of Alexander. And they wrote their bibliography 400 years after the fact. That's like saying, like, the history for the Revolutionary War is still yet to be written 100 years from now. Generally speaking, that's a lot of historical data. And over time, you know, a lot of historical data gets, you know, burned in fires in cities and museums. It just deteriorates. So there's a lot of evidence that is missing in ancient history. But despite all that, we have about 26,000 documents of the New Testament from ancient times. We have multiple other extra-biblical sources proclaiming the same message that Jesus Christ was buried, died, and physically raised from the dead. A good historical document is going to have two or more independent sources. With Christianity, we have several independent sources. We don't really have that with all historical events. And plus, of all ancient historical events, Christianity has the largest number of ancient documents. So I want to make that very clear. And the earliest, too. So some of your writings from Plato, the earliest document we have from that is from 900 AD. The earliest document we have for the New Testament is less than 150 AD. So right now we're winning. So we have the better evidence, it seems, you know, and the most closest evidence to the actual point that Jesus rose from the dead. So that's one of the points I'm trying to make here. So one of the objections that will be brought up against this is, and it's a good question, was it a physical resurrection or was it spiritual? You know, good question. Well, I'm going to tell you why it was physical. We have to remember, first of all, that the early Christians, the earliest, were Jewish. So you have to go by, what did Jewish people believe? Did Jewish people believe in a physical resurrection or a spiritual resurrection? Well, let's use their text. The oldest book in the whole entire Torah and Tanakh, you know, the Old Testament, as most people call it, is Job. Job chapter 19, 25 to 26 states this: "As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that the last he will take his stand on earth. Even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God." So already we have attestation from the Old Testament that Jewish people already believe in a physical resurrection. Psalm 16, 10 through 11, it states this: "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay." So once again, this is extra evidence that that the Jews believed in a physical resurrection. The early Christian Jews would never, ever, ever believe in a spiritual resurrection. They would never even listen to it for even a second. They'd only adhere to a physical resurrection. Plus, you got physical evidence. Jesus' body was never found. So, all right, we'll do. There it is. Cool. So anyway, there's also, so I mentioned the scriptural evidence. Jewish people only adhered to a physical resurrection. Now you got physical evidence. Jesus' body was never found. So clearly, you can't say that it was a spiritual resurrection, because if it was, his body would still be there. So his body wasn't there. That's the physical evidence that he physically raised from the dead. And then on top of that, you got the sect called the Pharisees. The Pharisees, okay, just like we have denominations today, like Baptist, Protestant, Catholic, whatever, you had, back in the early ancient Judaism, you had different sects of Judaism. So you had the Herodians, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes, and they all had different beliefs. The majority of all Israelites were Pharisees. According to Josephus, there were over 6,000 of them. And one of the apostles was actually a Pharisee himself, and a top-ranking Pharisee. Pharisees only adhered to a physical resurrection. They only believed in a physical resurrection. In fact, all the sects, except for the Sadducees, believed in a physical resurrection. The Sadducees never believed in a resurrection, period. So the Pharisees, though, believed in a physical resurrection. That's where Paul's coming from. So Paul is going to be a major point of evidence. I'll get to that later. So all this already adds up to the historical probability that there is already a case, and that Jesus already has some probability that he rose from the dead. So the first evidence I'm using is that Jesus died on the cross. All right, so why is that important? You're trying to debate resurrection, I thought. Well, if you don't have a physical death, you don't have a physical resurrection. It's kind of important. So basically, this has been studied. And so 2 medical scholars, medical journals will agree that, Jesus died of either asphyxiation. That study was done in 1986. They studied crucifixion. They found out that if you're in the low position on the cross, like basically when you're crucified, you're nailed and to the cross totally. Your feet are nailed, your hands are too. And if you're going down low in the low position, you just can't breathe. So to breathe, you have to stand up. So while the nails are digging into your flesh, and by the way, cutting off your nerves, so you couldn't even walk away after, even if you survived, you could never walk away from it because your nerves would be cut off to your feet and your hands. But if you had to stand up to be able to breathe with these nails digging further into your bone, the fact is, if you're in the low position for just 12 minutes, you die of asphyxiation automatically. You can do this in monkey bars. It's that simple. It's just because it pulls up on your muscles and it constricts your lungs. And so the other study was done in 2006, and one doctor argues it was pulmonary embolism that Jesus died of. So either way, people agree that Jesus died on the cross. Additionally, he was speared. You had blood and water coming out. The only possible way that could happen medically is if the spear struck the pericardium right before the heart. The pericardium is a sac of water that surrounds the heart. So for the fact that Luke mentions that blood and water came out, that attests to a medical fact. So you have all that evidence already that Jesus died on the cross. That already adds to the historical probability that Jesus rose from the dead.